When I was asked to talk, I was thinking about some things we'd been working on at the time, and so the abstract came out this way: new observations of past fast changes in greenhouse gases from ice cores. But given the general audience and the end of the meeting and the plenary session, I'll bring in some slightly more historical things and talk about a little more data than I was originally thinking about when I wrote the abstract. I'd certainly like to recognize all of my co-authors. Particularly, you're going to see a lot of data from Rachel Rhodes, Sean Marcotte, who were postdocs in my lab, James Lee and John Edwards, who were students, and Thomas Bosco also was a postdoc in my lab. I've added one other collaborator at the end of the list, Vas Petrenko, because I'd like to show you some new data from his group. And I should acknowledge here, because I might forget to, the Waste Divide Ice Core project. Waste Divide logo is here at the bottom. And this is a big American project that gave us some wonderful material to work on to study climate of the last ice age in Antarctica. Okay, so the overview here is, I'll say a little bit about the context. Why should we be interested in fast changes in greenhouse gases in the past, and what connection they might have to today. And what I'm going to talk about primarily are the behavior of atmospheric methane and carbon dioxide during abrupt events, specifically the Dansgaard-Oeschger events, and during Heinrich stadials, and, well, primarily during Heinrich stadials. The abstract mentions something we're interested in, which is observations of persistent short-term variability in atmospheric methane, which we don't completely understand, but might get some insights from this audience. I think I'll run out of time, but there is a slide in case I don't. But I would refer you to a paper published this year by Rachel Rhodes that describes some of these things. I'll point them out if I remember as I go along. One of the disadvantages of speaking at the end is I can't tell you about all the posters and talks that you could see at this meeting that show some of our data in more detail or do other things related to what I'm talking about, but I will mention some of them. Rachel had a poster, so maybe some of you saw that. Okay, why should we be interested in fast changes in greenhouse gases? Well, of course, generally we care about greenhouse gases because we care about the greenhouse effect, and many of us probably use this radiative forcing picture from the IPCC when we teach and talk about greenhouse gases. As Eric Wolf pointed out in his plenary talk, the near future isn't really like anything in the late Quaternary. So I made the right-hand plot on a pessimistic day, so I'm plotting RCP 6.0, which has, and these are the greenhouse gas trends used in that scenario for climate modeling, and CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide get to pretty high values, and we don't have that sort of thing in the ice core record over the last 800,000 years, and probably not going back quite a bit further. So we don't really help in that regard, but it is sort of interesting that the time frame for the radiative forcing changes that happen associated with these transients is on the order of a few centuries, and that is actually the time frame that we also see rapid transitions in climate and greenhouse gases in the ice core record. So maybe there's something we can glean about how the Earth system responds to fast things, even though the forcings are different. We also, of course, are interested because we want to know about the response of biogeochemical cycles to climate change. Methane is primarily a terrestrial thing, and carbon dioxide has a lot of marine sources and sinks. And we want to know about mechanisms and strengths of feedbacks. We want to know about surprises and tipping points in the climate system. So examples include wanting to know something about the impact of future warming on the Arctic carbon cycle, impact of changes in tropics, hydrological cycle on the carbon cycle, sensitivity of the ocean carbon cycle to climate change, and so on. Climate impacts on atmospheric chemistry, pick your favorite. biogeochemical problem. And of course, we're interested in testing models that might be able to predict changes like this. And of course, we're also just academically interested in how the Earth works. So there are lots of reasons to be interested in what's going on here. The panel on the left is just an example of some of the data we'll be talking about. These are the middle two diagrams are the waste divide methane record, and I'll talk a little bit more about waste divide in a minute, and then the waste divide carbon dioxide record. North grip isotopes at the top for Northern Hemisphere climate record, waste divide isotopes at the bottom. Now, we know the general pattern of these gases over time. We've known it for a while, and you've seen these data probably repeated many times over the course of this meeting. What's special about the newest data sets is their time resolution. My approach to developing these things is that we should really try to get the greenhouse gas records on a time resolution that's as close as possible to the actual lifetime of the gases in the atmosphere, so we can see as much of the variability as possible. And that's been made possible by, in some cases, new analytical methods. So we have a way of measuring methane continuously in ice core records with laser spectrometry, thanks to work that Rachel Rhodes did in my lab and other people worked on. And we can't do that with carbon dioxide yet, so we just do it by brute force. This took about a year to do, 2 or 3 or 4 samples a day, but it paid off, and this is work of Sean Marcotte. And these data are all published. I'm going to come back to really talking about some of the abrupt transitions in these data in a minute. So we should always show the long-term context in talk like this. This is the data compilations from the Epica Dome C ice core and the Vostok ice core for atmospheric CO2, methane, and temperature. Everybody's familiar with these plots. What I'm talking about is what happens here during the last ice age primarily. We would, of course, like to expand, looking in great detail, going back further in time, and that's starting to happen. It's a little bit difficult because these cores that go back this far have low accumulation rates, which makes it harder to get very detailed data. But just at this meeting, I've seen several presentations that are starting to look into all kinds of interesting details as we go back here. And it may be that our insights from this period will be revised as we get back further in time, but we're not there yet. Okay, so over the last, about, I'd say 20 years or so, we've started to zoom in on the last glacial period. This is a paper from 2008 showing atmospheric carbon dioxide, where we are starting to reveal in more detail millennial scale features in atmospheric CO2. And you can see the abrupt changes in atmospheric methane along the bottom here. These follow the northern hemisphere temperature pattern, and these follow the southern hemisphere temperature pattern and the bipolar seesaw. And so that pattern was well known when we started working in more detail on this, but the questions we wanted to answer have to do with what's really going on sort of associated with all of these cycles. One of the things I hope you'll get out of this is that on the really fine scale, there's some linkages between methane and carbon dioxide that may be telling us some interesting things. So this leads us to the waste divide ice core. As most of you know, in central Greenland, there are these fantastic ice core records. The snow creates an ice accumulation of about 20 centimeters per year in the Holocene, and those provide exquisite data about all sorts of things. But one of the things they don't provide us is a very good carbon dioxide record, because the ice in Greenland is too dusty and produces CO2 in situ. So there was a great desire to get a record from Antarctica that would have equivalent resolution to the Greenland records, and that's where the WAIS divide record came in. The site is here in West Antarctica. The modern accumulation rate is quite high for Antarctica. The initial idea was to try to go back into the Eemian, but it turned out there's a little more melting at the bottom of the ice sheet than we thought, and so the record is only 68,000 years old, but because of that, the younger age, we actually have even better time resolution in the data set than we expected. One of the most important things about this is that what we call the gas age ice age difference, which if you don't know about it, I'll explain it in the next slide, is very small, and this means that we can date the gas records relative to the ice very well. WAIS Divide Ice Core has an amazing chronology, layer counting to 30,000 years, very detailed ties into the northern hemisphere ice core stratigraphy, and speleothem chronologies for the older part. And because the accumulation rates are high, the process of trapping a gas in the firn doesn't create a great deal of smoothing. So we have a lot of detail that we can get out of this. And then, as I mentioned, we've also made some improvements in analytical methods over the years. So there's a huge amount of data coming out of the WAIS Divide project in all kinds of areas. I'm just going to touch on the greenhouse gas records here. But you'll see it certainly producing great information in other contexts. A lot of people in this room know a great deal about this, but for those who don't, gases are trapped at in the firn layer, or the unconsolidated snowpack, and gravity compresses the firn and ultimately traps air in bubbles. That happens somewhere between normally about 50 to 70 meters below the surface of the snow, which means that the air is younger than the ice that it's trapped in. This is an estimate from work that Christo Bowser did in our group of the delta age, or the age difference between the gas and the ice, as a function of time. And the important point is that it's quite low for an ice core record, 200 years in the Holocene, getting up to, at most, 500 years. And we have a variety of ways of constraining this pretty well. And so the uncertainty in that parameter is generally less than 100 years, sometimes quite a bit less. That's important. It really is. It means that this is conceivably the best Antarctic ice core record for gases. So here is sort of an overview of the data that I want to talk about. Time going from left to right, 68,000 years to 10,000. So I'm leaving the Holocene out just because I want to talk about abrupt changes, and that's what we've been focusing on. And these come from a paper by Rachel Rhodes in 2015. The deglacial CO2 record were published by Sean Marcotte. The rest of the CO2 record we're working on a paper for, and there have been some other papers about the stable isotope records. What I'm going to be talking about is the relationship between methane and the interstadial temperature patterns in Greenland. This is well known, so I'm going to just talk about it quickly and show a couple of new data slides, and then talk a little bit about the relationship between carbon dioxide and Antarctic isotope temperature maxima. Also pretty well known, but we have a lot more detail in the record here, so there's some interesting features to look at. And then the last thing I'll talk about is these little things, these little abrupt changes in CO2 and methane that we see during Heinrich stadials, times of iceberg discharge in the North Atlantic. And maybe they look a little bit small on this scale, but we think there's some interesting relationships there. And these have also been known to a certain extent, and I'd point to a paper by Miriam Gilovic in 2014 who discussed some of this from the sort of lower resolution data. What I think we can show some patterns that some people here know about and have been trying to figure out what they mean, but we can show them in a little more detail. So I'm going to start by just talking about methane and coming back to the question of what the methane variability during the Ice Age means. We generally think, or sort of the dominant hypothesis is that changes in methane sources dominate the ice core record. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In the modern methane budget, and this comes from a summary paper from Stephanie Kiersky, wetland emissions of methane due to microbial activity in anoxic waterlogged soils are the major source. There's methane from fresh water, and there are other sources, but the natural sources are primarily wetlands, lifetime of about 10 years in the atmosphere, and most of the methane is oxidized by OH in the troposphere. As I said, wetlands dominate the modern budget, and tropical wetlands dominate the wetland source. This is an aggregate of models predicting methane emission flux, and you can see the big region of methane emission in the tropics, Africa, Indonesia, South America, and then the high latitude methane sources, which must have been shut down to a certain extent during the ice ages. So this is sort of the context that we think about methane changes in. So when we look in detail at the ice core record, and I won't go through this part in a great deal of detail, we see that pretty much every Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillation and lots of sub-oscillations have a corresponding increase in methane. They're pretty rapid. They take place over about a century or so. We know very clearly that the methane rise follows the northern hemisphere temperature change by several decades. There's been a lot of discussion about this over the 20 years or so we've known about these abrupt fluctuations. Proposed causes include changes in methane emissions from wetlands, as I've been talking about, and people talk about the tropics and sometimes hypothesize changes in things like thermokarst lakes in the boreal regions. Permafrost is another popular topic. It's perhaps a source of methane during these transitions. There was a lot of talk in the 90s and in the 2000s about the possibility that the marine hydrate reservoir was unstable and might catastrophically release methane in the future, and maybe these are an indicator that that's possible. There's been quite a bit of interesting work on trying to understand whether the methane sink in the atmosphere is stable over climate changes, which is, as I read the literature, sort of the dominant view now, but has been an interesting question. And there have even been suggestions that the demise of megafauna around the time of the Younger Dryas might have reduced the ruminant methane source and caused this decrease to happen. That one I wouldn't take too seriously, but there's been a lot of work trying to understand some of the others. The general picture, as I said, is that wetlands are accepted as the source, the dominant source during the Lake Quaternary. And this comes from a variety of data sets. There are both stable isotope and radiocarbon data that rule out the clathrate methane source. I'll show you a picture of one of those data sets in a second. We can look at the difference between the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere concentrations and get some idea of how much low latitude methane there is, which is probably wetlands. And that seems to change during the Dansgaard-Oeschger events. Carbon isotopes of methane, it turns out, don't really change at all when these things happen. And that's also consistent with a change in the amount of wetland emissions. And as I mentioned, the methane sink changes are possible. So far, models don't really seem to support them. And as many of you know, there's lots of evidence for changes in low-latitude hydrology on these timescales from speleothems and other things. So I'm going to
Wetlands are really what we think about, but we can look at some data. First of all, just some stable isotope data. In the waste divide ice core, we were able to actually drill down and then go back in the hole and drill sideways and then drill down again. And that was the reason we did that, was to get as much material as we could for certain key climate transitions. One of them was Dansgaard-Oeschger Event 8, which is, and this is the methane increase associated with that feature over this very short, just like 1,500-year interval. And here you see the continuous methane data in all its glory. One of my graduate students is working on carbon isotopes of methane. They're quite complicated, and this work was done with our colleagues at the University of Bern, who are incredibly good at making this measurement. And what you see in these data, which are resolved at a little less than 50 years, is that the delta C13, sorry, this label got cut off, this is the delta C13 of methane, doesn't really change before and after this event. There's a little anomaly here, which is actually a consequence of what we call isotopic disequilibrium, because the oxidation of methane in the atmosphere makes the delta C13 heavier than the source values, but that's expected. The important point is that things don't seem to change across here. And this is a diagram of the C13 of methane versus the delta D of methane with different source values plotted here. And the main point of the isotopic data in this case is just that although the concentration changes by a lot, nothing changes about the isotopes. And so that suggests that what's happening is climate is driving the sources bigger, but we're not really changing the balance of sources. This is perhaps a more interesting and unique data set from my colleague Vas Petrenko at the University of Rochester. And some time ago, Vas and his then thesis supervisor, Jeff Severinghaus, decided that we should measure the radiocarbon content of methane crossing one of these transitions. And the idea there is that any dead carbon source, for example, methane hydrates on the seafloor, which we're all concerned about perhaps in future warming scenarios, would make the radiocarbon of methane go down. And the challenge with doing this is that one sample is 1,000 kilograms. And so you can't do that from an ice core, but you can do that if you can find old ice outcropping in a glacier where the glacier flow has brought old ice to the surface. So this is the Taylor Glacier in Antarctica. For anybody that's been to the dry valleys, that's the terminus of Taylor Glacier. And it turns out that exposed on the surface of this glacier upstream from here is ice anywhere from about 10,000 years to 150,000 years old. And if you work hard enough, you can find the right sections to work on. And so Vas was able to extract air from 1,000 kilogram samples in this big melt chamber that we take in the field. And through really more than a decade of work trying to get this right, measure the radiocarbon content, in this case, across the termination of the Unger Dryas. So the red is an ice core records, the black are the methane concentrations in the monster samples, and then here you see the age-corrected radiocarbon plotted with the in-cal atmospheric curve in green. And the essential point is that it doesn't change. So radiocarbon of methane is contemporaneous with the CO2 in the modern atmosphere, which is completely consistent with a wetland-dominated source. If you had dead carbon causing this increase, you would have a big drop here. Michael Dionysius, one of Vas's students, has done the same thing for the Bowling-Allerod transition, finds the same answer. So some of you may have seen his poster back in the corner a couple of days ago at this meeting. Okay, so we know something about these Dansgaard-Oeschger events, and then I'm going to move on here quickly to looking at anomalies in atmospheric methane during Heinrich stadials. This is something that Rachel Rhodes discovered in our data set. So I plotted here in blue Heinrich stadial 5, 4, 2, and 1, and these are if these are the Heinrich stadials in the North Atlantic that are associated with large amounts of ice-rafted debris and are believed to be sourced in Hudson Strait. And the other Heinrich 6 and Heinrich 3 are a little bit different. And what we see in the ice core record here are these little jumps in methane that occur at each of these. And we also see, as I'll show, some increases in atmospheric CO2 at the same time. So here in more detail are the methane anomalies. This is published in Rachel's paper. And so this is interstadial 12. And right before that, there's this really, really sharp but small uptick, which we have almost missed in other kinds of records. And then interstadial 8 and another uptick here in methane in the middle of the stadial period. And let's see what's next. This is a figure from Rachel's paper. She's showing the relationship between these small events and other kinds of records. So this ice-rafted debris data sets here, and two cave deposits, the Hulu Cave from the northern subtropics and a cave from South America at about 11 degrees south. And there's a well-known sort of antiphase relationship between the rainfall proxies and the cave records, and a well-known idea that when you have cooling in the northern hemisphere, ITCZ is migrating southward and moving rainfall belts southward. And our hypothesis is that these sharp increases in methane are actually a signature of the Heinrich event impact on the tropical hydrologic cycle. And if that's true, it's a hypothesis, it actually provides a way to say in the ice core record where the Heinrich event impact happened, which is something that we want to know. But it's a hypothesis. Perhaps there might be other explanations. And one interesting thing we've come up with very recently is that there's a different kind of methane isotope anomaly. Again, apologies for somehow the label got messed up here. This is delta C13 of methane. And at the time of that little uptick, which we were associating with a Heinrich event, there's actually a heavy isotope anomaly. It's very short-lived and in methane. And this type of anomaly is hard to explain except if you invoke the only kind of the only heavy source that you could conceive of that would change fast, which is biomass burning. So I wouldn't tune up your methane emission model quite just yet, but there's an interesting feature here which may suggest that there's some big fire impact right at this event that happens relatively quickly. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do is just talk about abrupt changes in atmospheric carbon dioxide that happen around the time of these, or happen at the same time as we see these methane variations during the Heinrich stadials. So now we're going to be focusing on what's happening here. And if you look closely, you'll see there's an abrupt CO2 increase here. There's an abrupt CO2 increase at 16,000 years that we know that is pretty well known. And we can take a look at those in a little more detail. And I'll just use Heinrich Stadial 4 as an example because it illustrates some of the patterns in carbon dioxide that we see. First of all, sort of going backwards, at the time of Dansgaard-Oeschger Event 8, CO2 is already high, but there's actually an additional increase in carbon dioxide that happens at that time. And this is a feature that you see in some of the older data as well, and I've seen people at this meeting thinking about interpreting that feature. And we know from the WAIS divide core, because we're measuring all these gases in exactly the same samples, that these things are completely synchronous. And we go back to that methane anomaly that starts here, and there's this very sharp increase in CO2, about 10 ppm in about 100 years. And so that's really the beginning of this feature that we associate with Antarctic temperature actually has this abrupt feature. And then CO2 stays high for a little while after Antarctica starts to cool, perhaps because it's influenced by the Dansgaard-Oeschger event. So that's the second part of the feature there. So we would say that this feature that we associate with Heinrich events is also directly impacting CO2. See these same kinds of features if I blow up some of the other Heinrich stadials. So this is 5, 2, and 1. Dansgaard-Oeschger 12 there, and then the Heinrich stadial methane increase and a small uptick in CO2. Here we have a Dansgaard-Oeschger 2, and you can see that there's a small methane increase that happens right before that. Not much change in CO2 there. And then Heinrich stadial, during Heinrich stadial 1, you can see about a 10 ppm increase in CO2 during the Younger Dryas, and again, at what we might associate with Heinrich event 1, about a 10 ppm increase in CO2 associated with this little tiny feature in the methane record that we think is real, and no temperature change in Greenland. So there are sort of two kinds of carbon dioxide changes here, one associated with Greenland warming and one associated with these Heinrich stadial events. Okay, so 2 more slides before I'm done. I just wanted to show that Thomas Bosca has done a lot of great work on carbon isotopes and so of CO2. So when we now look at the C13 of CO2 in these associated with these events, we see a negative is up on this plot, anomaly in C13 of CO2. I won't take too much time to try to explain how we interpret this, but we're seeing obviously an input of light carbon into the system. There are a variety of ways that you can do that through ocean circulation or gas exchange mechanisms. One of the things we think is interesting is to ask whether there's actually a short period of terrestrial biosphere increase in CO2 associated with some of these events, because there's a very fast change in C13 here. And then note that if you're interested in this part of the record, there actually isn't much change in delta C13 there. And this event, which is just one of the Heinrich stadials, resembles quite a bit the first stage of the deglaciation, because we also have C13 data from that time period. And during the first half of the deglaciation, we see this major change in delta C13, and right at the 16.3 K event, we see an abrupt trend towards more negative values, again, kind of like the event at the beginning of Heinrich, or at the beginning of the event during Heinrich Stadial 4. And then these are published now, but as we go into the second half of the deglaciation, C13 actually doesn't change all that much. So there are other mechanisms involved in getting all the way to the deglacial value of CO2. And maybe the last thing to point out for people who don't know about it is that at the end of the Younger Dryas, there's yet another fairly rapid change in atmospheric CO2. So that was the last slide, and I'll try to take questions if I can.